One thing that impressed me very much when I first met Prabhupada, that he said was, "I am not this body." I knew that there was a deeper meaning to it because I didn't feel that way myself, but I thought that he, for one, really felt that way. He looked very distinguished. He was an older person. He was from India, and he had all of the makings of a spiritually realized person. I've met persons before who I found some faults with. They were hypocritical in one way or another. But when I met Srila Prabhupada, I didn't find these difficulties. So I approached him. I approached him at the end of his conversation. And the first words that came out of my mouth were, "I have a tambura." That's the first thing I said to him. And the first thing he said to me, he said, "Then bring it." And he gestured this way, "Then bring it." So I came a few days later with the tambura, and he was chanting, he was speaking. He had a big book in front of him. I didn't know what the book was, but every once in a while he would glance down and read from the book. It was a book of Sanskrit, apparently, a very large book. And I was impressed by the whole surrounding atmosphere. It was a very unkempt and desultory sort of place, a loft in the Bowery. And I thought, well, there can't really be anything that's wrong with this. I thought, I'll just keep continuing to come and see what he has to say. I think what happened was that I was involved in a kind of, you might say, legal and police problem. It was the kind of a problem where people kind of shunned me or ignored me. My phone stopped ringing, for example, and the person who came to tune my piano, for one, didn't respond, didn't call. And probably the first person that called me was Prabhupada. He called me Mr. Michael. And he said, almost his exact words were, "Mr. Michael, there has been some trouble," in a questioning way. And I didn't tell him exactly what it was, but I kind of minimized it more than it really was. And then he invited me to come to his place, which I did, and had lunch with the devotees and Prabhupada himself. I thought Prabhupada was very unjudgmental. He respected me and he called me Mr. Michael, which was unusual for someone to append the word Mr. to a first name. But he was almost fatherly, you might say, or grandfatherly. And he was one of probably the only person that maintained contact with me after my reputation had been smirched. My musical colleagues didn't want to have anything to do with me because my problem appeared in the New York Times, and many of those people had actually read about it. And I thought that this was a very significant thing, that Prabhupada had heard about it, but at the same time he was not dismissing me or in any way belittling me or thinking that he shouldn't have anything to do with me. One day before I was initiated, I was walking north on 3rd Avenue with a fellow named Raya Rama. Raymond Marias is his legal name. And he said that the Swami is going to be conducting initiation. Would you like to take part? And I thought, wow, what is this initiation? I'd never heard the word before related to what we were doing. And he said, well, I don't know much about it either, Raya Rama said. He said that what Swamiji said was that it means that you take your guru as God. And I thought to myself, that can't be right. He's not God, obviously. And then I learned later that Vishwanath Chakravarti said that a guru is to be taken as good as God. So that was quite different. And during the initiation ceremony, there were several people. I decided to do it, but I didn't know what it meant. I just thought, oh, it's some sort of a rite of passage. Why not? Everyone else is doing it that I know. Why not do it? And afterwards, I went back to where I was domiciled and saw Allen Ginsberg on television chanting Hare Krishna. So that was a kind of symbolic gesture to me that I had done the right thing. Well, when I first heard about a person named Mishra, or Dr. Mishra, I heard that Prabhupada, who was then known as the Old Swami, was lecturing in Dr. Mishra's apartment somewhere in Manhattan. And then his name was forgotten. One day, Prabhupada announced that he would be taking all of us devotees on a field trip. He didn't use the term field trip, but we kind of understood it was in a place called Monroe, New York, upstate New York. There was an ashram there, maybe of about 4 or 5 or 6, I forget the size of it, number of acres, and it was Dr. Mishra's ashram, his country ashram. One day when Dr. Mishra was away from that ashram, Prabhupada held class. It was a late afternoon or evening class. And it was mostly populated by devotees. But there were a few people there who were from Dr. Mishra's ashram. They were either ashramites or people who were frequenters of Dr. Mishra. They had a book that Dr. Mishra had written. Prabhupada, during his class, was talking about various things about Vaishnavism. And these two men that were disciples or friends of Dr. Mishra, or regular followers, began to argue with Prabhupada during the question period. And they said, because they were kind of impersonalists, they said that there was a phrase called, "I am a bubble, make me the sea," which is a kind of Shankarite version of jnana or impersonality. And Prabhupada said, well, before you read more of the book, answer me this one question. If the gold in a gold ring and the gold in the gold mine are the same, then, but they're also different, is there a difference between the gold in the gold mine and the gold ring? And this stimulated a lot of questioning, a lot of further questioning on the part of these two men. And eventually Prabhupada was saying that the gold ring and the gold mine are simultaneously one and different. This was a concept that these two men found very difficult to assimilate. This was the first time I ever saw Prabhupada get a little angry or agitated. These two men were advocating that there's no difference at all ever between the gold in the gold mine and the gold in the gold ring. But Prabhupada was trying to teach them that there was a difference. They were the same in quality, but different in quantity, and that this was a major difference. So Prabhupada got a little angry, and it was the first time I'd ever seen that mood of Prabhupada becoming angry. But that happened at Monroe Ashram in New York City, in upper state New York.
And they never surrendered.
As far as I know, these two men never changed their conviction about being impersonalists or diehard impersonalists, we might say. And they were older than most of us. They were probably in their late 20s or early 30s, and they were dressed in business suits, very much unlike the sort of hippie alternatives that we all were, even though not all of us had long hair. I think when Srila Prabhupada had a bit of an altercation with these two men, I saw another side of him, that he was not only a teacher, but he was a fighter. He would fight for what was right, even though he would encounter imposing elements. When there was a philosophical discussion, he would fight for what was right. And in most cases, he would win that fight. One of the things that I wrote about in my book is the fact that when Prabhupada was on 26 2nd Avenue, he gave a lecture. At the end of a lecture, a man came in to the storefront who looked very disheveled. He smelled like a liquor factory, and his pants were very baggy, his hair was very messed up, and he reached inside his coat as if he were reaching for a pistol. I didn't know what he was going to do, and out came a roll of toilet paper, and he proceeded to plunk it down on Prabhupada's lectern, and then he walked out. And Prabhupada, as I remember, just kind of said, "See, he is service-minded." And the next day, the same man came back to 26 2nd Avenue, or 2 days later, And this time he didn't have baggy pants, his hair was combed, and he was sober, and he just sat down and listened. So it was a whole different thing. He had transformed, become a completely different person. One evening during the question period, after the Swami had lectured, the lawyer, Stephen Goldsmith, stood up and asked him this question. I mean, I don't know it word for word, but basically he said, if God is so kind, why is he letting so many American boys die in Vietnam? And Prabhupada, without even waiting for a half of a second, immediately answered, God is seeing that you're killing so many cows, so he's saying, send your sons to the slaughterhouse. And he made this kind of a gesture, send your sons to the slaughterhouse. Goldsmith's response to that rejoinder was that he just sat down and accepted what Prabhupada said as being true. It was just too much for him to absorb all at once, it seemed. One day when I was in Prabhupada's room when the San Francisco temple had first started, I was sitting in front of Prabhupada and a man burst in the room, a fellow that had been a regular, and he said that, Swamiji, your prime minister has been stoned. And Swamiji looked up very innocently and said to him, why was that? And then this man proceeded to say that he had read in a newspaper article there was a very severe drought in Maharashtra, and that people stoned the prime minister because they blamed her, it was Indira Gandhi at the time, for the drought. And he thought that Prabhupada would be very stricken with this news, but Prabhupada kind of smiled and said to him, this shows that everything is very personal in India, that they blame the leader for anything that goes wrong, even if the weather is improper or in any way causing difficulty. So a number of the people who were farmers in that state, in that part of India, converged upon the prime minister and began to blame her and stone her. So Prabhupada picked out the good part of that to show that people in India tend to blame the leader when anything goes wrong. That there was still a vestige of Vedic culture existing even in modern day India. In San Francisco in 1967, on Prabhupada's first visit, at the end of his class he asked for questions. One man was standing opposite him, with kind of leaning up against the wall in a standing posture, and pretty much everyone else was sitting. And he had his hands in his pocket, and he asked this kind of challenging question to Prabhupada because he knew that Prabhupada had something to do with the poet Allen Ginsberg. He asked Prabhupada, are you Allen Ginsberg's guru? And he said it in a kind of challenging tone. Prabhupada immediately looked down and answered, I am nobody's guru. I am everybody's servant. And that was the end of that. And that person didn't ask any further questions and just accepted the answer he got. While I was staying at John Lennon's estate in the servants' quarters, along with Srila Prabhupada in a different section, we were all told that the bricklayer that was on hire by John Lennon had experienced ghosts. He confided in his wife, who confided, so-called, with other female devotees, that he was hearing sounds that sounded like a body was being dragged across the floor above where he was living in chains. But he didn't want others to know about this. But somehow it did get back to Prabhupada that was happening. And the bricklayer was concerned that because he had heard these sounds that kept him awake at night, that he wouldn't be able to continue with his work of bricklaying for John Lennon. So it was becoming a very dangerous and critical situation. When Prabhupada heard about what was going on, he said that the devotee should go into the bricklayer's apartment when he wasn't there, have a roaring kirtan with blowing of conch shells and a very loud kirtan that went on for at least 4 hours, and that this would drive away the ghosts. What happened, we learned the next day, was that the bricklayer the following night didn't hear the sounds of what he thought were ghosts in the rooftop, and was able to get a good night's sleep and can carry on with his work. And so this story has a very happy ending. It's a true story, by the way, of an exorcism that was done by the holy name at the behest of a pure devotee. And it saved a person's livelihood and life. The only time I was with Prabhupada and George Harrison was when Prabhupada recited to him a translation of a verse that I think it was Rupa Goswami who said that, or Sanatana Goswami who said that I only have 2 ears and 1 tongue, and I wish that I had millions of ears and millions of tongues so I could better relish the chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. And I remember George Harrison saying he liked that verse, and Prabhupada asking Pradyumna to give him a cassette copy of that verse in English and in whatever language it was. There seemed to be a very strong relationship between Prabhupada and George Harrison. And what happened one day was when George came, Prabhupada was resting. It was an afternoon time, and he awoke to meet with George, and he said that this sleeping is a very bad habit. He said, it's just a waste of time. I don't like to do it. And George appreciated that. I was there at that time when Prabhupada arose from his sleep and came to meet George. The characteristic of Prabhupada that stands out the most for me was probably his humility and his affection. He was like a father and a grandfather to me. So that above all the other qualities, saintly qualities that he had, and still has, probably were the ones that were most meaningful to me. Karuna Prachu